The courtroom was silent, save for the muffled sobs of a few onlookers. The teenage girl stood in the witness stand, her hands gripping the wooden edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her stepdad sat a few feet away, his face pale, his jaw set. All eyes were on her, but her focus was on the judge, a woman known for her unwavering composure. Then, the girl spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "For years, I stayed quiet because I thought no one would believe me. But I can't keep silent anymore. My stepdad isn't the man he pretends to be. He's been hiding something terrible." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in concern. "And what is that, Olivia?" the judge asked gently, her voice cracking ever so slightly. Olivia swallowed hard, a single tear slipping down her cheek. He hurt my mom. He hurt me. And he made me feel like it was my fault." The judge's expression shifted in an instant, from professional neutrality to raw, unguarded emotion. Her lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, but the judge quickly banged her gavel to restore order. "Enough," she said, her voice breaking. But her tears continued to fall, no matter how hard she tried to maintain control. The tension in the room was unbearable. What had Olivia endured? What secrets had been hidden behind the walls of her home? And why was the judge crying? 6 months earlier, Olivia's life had seemed ordinary, or as ordinary as it could be for a 14-year-old girl living in a small town in Indiana. She lived with her mom, Sarah, and her stepdad, Greg. On the surface, they looked like the perfect family. Greg worked as a mechanic, Sarah ran a small bakery, and Olivia excelled in school. But behind closed doors, things were different. It started with little things. Greg's voice would get too loud when he was angry. He'd slam doors or throw things when dinner wasn't perfect. At first, Olivia thought it was just stress. Her mom always told her, "Greg works hard to take care of us. He's just tired." But tiredness didn't explain the bruises. Olivia noticed them on her mom's arms first, small, purple marks that Sarah tried to hide with long sleeves, even on the hottest days. "I bumped into the oven," she'd say, brushing off Olivia's concern. But as the bruises became more frequent, Olivia stopped believing the excuses. She started watching Greg more closely. Greg's anger grew worse over time. He didn't just yell at her mom. He started yelling at Olivia too. If she got a B instead of an A, he'd call her lazy. If she spent too much time in her room, he'd accuse her of being ungrateful. Olivia learned to walk on eggshells, always trying to avoid setting him off. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a Saturday, and Sarah had spent hours preparing Greg's favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans. Olivia sat at the table, nervously picking at her food while Greg glared at his plate. "This is cold," he snapped, shoving the plate away. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it. "I'll warm it up." "Don't bother," Greg shouted, standing so abruptly that his chair tipped over. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Stop it," Olivia yelled, jumping to her feet. Her heart pounded as she stared at her stepdad, who turned his anger toward her. "What did you just say to me?" he growled, stepping closer. Olivia froze, fear rooting her to the spot. Sarah stepped between them. "Leave her alone, Greg." For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. But then, with a swift motion, he shoved Sarah aside. She stumbled, hitting her head on the corner of the table as she fell. "Mom!" Olivia screamed, rushing to her side. Blood trickled from a small cut on Sarah's forehead, but she waved Olivia away. "I'm fine," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "Go to your room." Olivia didn't move. She stared at Greg, who looked angrier than ever. For the first time, she realized just how dangerous he was. If she didn't do something, things would only get worse. The next morning, while Greg was at work, Olivia begged her mom to leave. "We can go somewhere safe," she said. "We can stay with Aunt Laura." But Sarah refused. "Greg has a temper, but he's not a bad person," she insisted. "He's just going through a rough patch." Olivia knew it was more than that, but she didn't know how to convince her mom. So she started documenting everything, taking pictures of bruises, writing down dates and times when Greg lost his temper. She even recorded one of his outbursts on her phone, hiding it under the table while he yelled at Sarah for burning his toast. It wasn't enough to tell people what was happening. She needed proof. Months passed, and Olivia continued gathering evidence. She thought she was being careful, but one night, Greg found her notebook. She had left it on her bed by accident, and when he stormed into her room holding it, her stomach dropped. "What's this?" he demanded, shaking the notebook in her face. Olivia tried to grab it, but Greg held it out of reach. "Are you spying on me?" he shouted. "Telling lies about me?" "They're not lies," Olivia shot back, her voice trembling. "You hurt us, Greg. Someone has to stop you." His face turned red with anger. "You think anyone's going to believe a little girl like you? You're nothing." Olivia felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to back down. "I'm not nothing," she said quietly, "and one day, everyone will know what you've done." Greg stormed out of the room, taking the notebook with him. Olivia didn't know what he would do next, but she was more determined than ever to protect her mom and herself. That's how they ended up in court. Olivia told her story with courage she didn't know she had, laying bare all the secrets Greg had worked so hard to keep hidden. She showed the judge the pictures, the recordings, the bruises her mom had tried to hide. She revealed everything. And when she finished, the courtroom was silent once more. All eyes were on the judge, who wiped her tears with a tissue before speaking. "I've seen many cases in my career," the judge said, her voice trembling. "But Olivia, your bravery is unlike anything I've ever witnessed. You've not only told the truth, but you've shown us the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Before she could continue, a commotion erupted in the courtroom. Greg's lawyer stood, looking pale. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe." But before he could finish, the door to the courtroom burst open, and a new figure walked in, holding a folder. Everyone turned to see who it was, and Olivia's heart stopped. The courtroom fell silent as the man stepped inside, clutching a folder that looked worn from years of handling. His suit was slightly wrinkled, and his face bore a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He locked eyes with Olivia for a brief moment, then turned his attention to the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but calm, "I have critical evidence that directly pertains to this case." The judge, still visibly moved by Olivia's testimony, straightened in her seat. "And who are you, sir?" "My name is Daniel Harper. I'm a social worker from Child Protective Services. I've been working on a case involving Mr. Greg Thatcher for the past 3 years." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Greg's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he sank lower in his seat. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. What could this man know? And why hadn't anyone stopped Greg before now? "Order!" the judge barked, banging her gavel. Once the room quieted, she gestured for Daniel to approach. "Mr. Harper, you may submit your evidence." Daniel handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. "Your Honor, this file contains police reports, witness statements, and medical records that document a pattern of abuse committed by Mr. Thatcher against his previous family." Gasps echoed through the room. Olivia's eyes widened as she glanced at her mom, who looked just as stunned. She had never known Greg had another family. Sarah whispered, "I didn't know. I didn't know." The judge flipped through the pages, her face growing darker with each document. This is horrific," she muttered under her breath before addressing the courtroom. According to these records, Mr. Thatcher was investigated for domestic violence against his ex-wife and children. However, the case was dropped when the victims recanted their statements, citing fear of retaliation. This evidence paints a troubling picture. Greg shot up from his seat, his voice booming with anger. "This is ridiculous. They're lying. I've done nothing wrong." The judge glared at him. "Sit down, Mr. Thatcher. Any further outbursts will result in your removal from this courtroom." Greg reluctantly obeyed, but his fists clenched tightly, and his jaw twitched with barely contained fury. Olivia felt a mix of fear and vindication. For so long, she had felt invisible, unheard. But now, people were finally seeing the truth. Daniel continued, I've also spoken to neighbors and co-workers who witnessed Mr. Thatcher's aggressive behavior. While none of them felt safe enough to come forward before, they've provided written statements included in the file. The judge nodded. This evidence corroborates Olivia's testimony and provides crucial context. I will consider it carefully. Olivia's heart swelled with hope. Maybe, just maybe, Greg would finally face the consequences of his actions. But then the judge's next words sent a chill down her spine. Given the severity of these allegations, I am ordering a recess to allow both parties to review this new evidence. Court will resume in 2 days. As the courtroom emptied, Olivia stayed close to her mom. Sarah seemed dazed, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. Greg was escorted out by security, his eyes burning with rage. Olivia didn't feel safe until he was gone. Outside the courthouse, Daniel approached them. Olivia, Sarah, can we talk for a moment? He asked gently. Sarah hesitated but nodded. They found a quiet bench under a tree, away from the crowd. Daniel sat across from them, his expression softening. I know this is a lot to process, he began, but I want you both to know you're not alone. Olivia, what you did today took incredible bravery. You may have saved not just yourself and your mom, but others who might have been hurt by Greg in the future. Olivia looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushing with a mix of pride and anxiety. I couldn't let him keep getting away with it. Daniel nodded. And you didn't. But there's still a long road ahead. Greg won't give up easily, and he may try to intimidate you. If that happens, you need to tell me or the authorities immediately. Sarah wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't anyone warn me about Greg's past? How did he hide all of this? Daniel sighed. Unfortunately, abusers are often skilled at hiding their true selves. Greg moved to a new town, started a new life, and built a facade of being a hard-working, caring man. It's not your fault, Sarah. He deceived you, just like he deceived everyone else. Olivia reached for her mom's hand, squeezing it tightly. Mom, we're going to get through this. Together. Sarah nodded, her lips trembling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I just want to protect you, Olivia. I should have done more. It's not your fault, Olivia interrupted firmly. Greg's the one who did this, not you. The next 2 days were tense. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was watching them, even though a restraining order had been put in place. She kept the doors locked at all times and jumped at every sound. Her mom stayed busy at the bakery, trying to keep her mind off the upcoming hearing, but Olivia could see the fear in her eyes. On the night before the court date, Olivia had trouble sleeping. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. What if Greg found a way to manipulate the system again? What if the judge didn't believe them? The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Olivia sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and crept toward the window. Peeking out through the curtains, she saw a shadowy figure near the side of the house. Her blood ran cold. It was Greg. Olivia froze, her breath caught in her throat. Greg was standing in the shadows near the side of the house, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. He moved slowly, methodically, as if he were checking for an easy way inside. Her heart raced. What was he doing here? He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near them. She backed away from the window and grabbed her phone with trembling hands. Her first instinct was to call her mom, but she realized Sarah wasn't home. She had stayed late at the bakery to prepare an order for a big event. Olivia knew there was no time to wait. With shaking fingers, she dialed 911. As the phone rang, she crouched in the corner of her room, her back pressed against the wall. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. Greg, my stepdad. He's here, Olivia whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. He's not supposed to be near us. He's outside the house. The dispatcher's tone became more urgent. Stay on the line, Olivia. Officers are on their way. Can you see him now? Olivia peeked through the curtains again. Greg had moved to the back of the house, his head tilted as if he were listening for something. She noticed he was holding a crowbar. He's trying to get in, Olivia whispered. He has something in his hand. Stay where you are and keep quiet, the dispatcher instructed. The police will be there soon. Olivia nodded, even though they couldn't see her. She stayed on the line, her body trembling as the minutes crawled by. Then she heard it, the sound of glass shattering. Greg was inside. Olivia's mind raced. She couldn't stay in her room. If Greg found her, she didn't want to think about what he might do. Quietly, she slipped her phone into her pocket and crept to the door. She listened for any sound, her ears straining to pick up his movements. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. He was coming closer. She had to move. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door as silently as possible and slipped into the hallway. She moved toward the stairs, her socks muffling her steps. Her goal was to reach the front door and get outside before Greg realized she was gone. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard his voice. "Olivia," he called, his tone low and menacing. "You can't hide from me. You think you're so smart, don't you? Running to the cops, making up lies about me." She froze, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She turned her head slowly and saw him standing at the end of the hallway, his shadow stretching toward her. The crowbar glinted in his hand. "Come here," he demanded, taking a step forward. Olivia's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She bolted down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. Greg shouted after her, his footsteps pounding as he chased her. She reached the front door and fumbled with the lock. Her hands were slick with sweat, and the deadbolt wouldn't turn. She could hear Greg getting closer, his breaths heavy with anger. Just as his shadow loomed over her, red and blue lights flashed outside the window, and sirens blared. Olivia let out a sob of relief as Greg froze, his head snapping toward the sound. A voice boomed from outside. "Police, step away from the door and put your hands up." Greg hesitated for a moment, then dropped the crowbar with a loud clatter. He raised his hands as two officers burst through the door, their guns drawn. They grabbed Greg and forced him to the ground. He thrashed and cursed, but they pinned him down and cuffed him. One of the officers looked at Olivia, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face. He broke in. "He was going to hurt me." "You're safe now," the officer said gently. "We've got him." As they led Greg out of the house, he glared at Olivia. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." Olivia's stomach churned, but she refused to let him see her fear. She stood tall, watching as the police took him away. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this really was the beginning of the end. When Sarah returned home later that night, she found Olivia sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was pale, and her hands were still shaking. Sarah dropped her purse and rushed to her daughter's side. "Olivia, what happened? Are you okay?" Olivia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Greg," he broke in. "The police took him away." Sarah's face went white. He came here? I can't believe this. I should have been home." "It's not your fault, Mom," Olivia said firmly. "He's the one who chose to do this. And now he's gone." Sarah hugged her tightly, her tears soaking into Olivia's hair. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." The next day in court, Greg's unexpected break-in became the focal point of the hearing. Daniel Harper testified about the incident, emphasizing how it demonstrated Greg's disregard for the law and the restraining order. Olivia sat in the witness stand again, recounting the terrifying events of the previous night. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. When she finished, the judge turned her attention to Greg. "Mr. Thatcher," the judge said, her tone icy, "your actions are not only reckless but also deeply disturbing. Breaking into a home and terrorizing a minor shows a complete lack of remorse. You've left me no choice but to escalate this case." Greg tried to defend himself, but the judge silenced him with a sharp glare. "You've already said enough." The tension in the room was palpable as the judge prepared to deliver her ruling. But just as she was about to speak, the courtroom door opened once again. A woman entered, her face pale and her hands clutching a stack of papers. She walked straight to the front of the room, her eyes locked on Greg. "My name is Laura Thatcher," she announced, her voice trembling. "I'm Greg's ex-wife, and I have something to say." The room was stunned into silence as Laura Thatcher stood at the front, her presence commanding attention. She was a thin woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, her face lined with years of hardship. She clutched a stack of papers tightly, as if they were her lifeline. Greg's face drained of color. "Laura, what are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice low but laced with panic. The judge motioned for Laura to approach the witness stand. "Mrs. Thatcher, you say you have something to share. Please proceed." Laura took a deep breath and stepped up, her hands trembling as she placed the papers on the stand. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I've been silent for far too long. I came here today to tell the truth about Greg Thatcher and what he did to me and my children." Olivia's heart pounded as she watched Laura. For years, she had been desperate to hear someone confirm what she had experienced, to prove that Greg's cruelty wasn't all in her head. Now, it seemed like that moment had finally come. Laura began to speak, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. "I was married to Greg for 10 years. During that time, he abused me in ways I can barely describe. He controlled every aspect of my life, what I wore, who I talked to, where I went. And when I tried to stand up to him, he would." She paused, swallowing hard. "He would hurt me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Laura's gaze swept the room before landing on Olivia. "He did the same to my children. My son, Ethan, was only 8 when Greg broke his arm because he refused to clean his room fast enough. My daughter, Lily, was 6 when she told me Greg yelled at her for spilling juice on the couch. But it wasn't just yelling. He pushed her so hard she hit her head on the wall." Olivia's hands balled into fists. She felt a surge of anger and sadness for these children she had never met, who had endured the same pain she and her mom had suffered. Laura wiped a tear from her cheek. "I wanted to leave, but I was terrified. Greg always said no one would believe me, that he'd make my life a living hell if I tried. And when I finally did leave, he followed through on that promise. He harassed me, threatened me, even filed for custody of the kids just to punish me." The judge leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mrs. Thatcher, why are you coming forward now?" Laura turned to face Greg, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and determination. "Because I heard about what he's done to Olivia and Sarah. I couldn't let him destroy another family the way he destroyed mine." As Laura's testimony continued, she presented the papers she had brought with her, medical records documenting her injuries, police reports from the time she had called for help, and letters Greg had written to her after their divorce, full of threats and manipulative pleas. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge carefully reviewed each document, her expression growing darker with every page. When Laura finished, she looked at Greg. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Thatcher?" the judge asked coldly. Greg's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Greg shook his head. "No," he spat, glaring at Laura. "This is all lies. She's just bitter because I moved on." Laura's voice rose in anger. "You're still the same monster you've always been, Greg. But this time, you won't get away with it." The judge raised her hand to silence them. "That's enough. Mr. Thatcher, it's clear that you have a history of abusive behavior. Coupled with your actions last night, it's evident that you pose a significant threat to those around you. I am placing you under immediate arrest for violating the restraining order and for your past offenses." Greg's face twisted in rage as officers approached to take him into custody. He struggled against them, shouting profanities, but they ignored him. As he was dragged out of the courtroom, he locked eyes with Olivia one last time. "This isn't over," he growled. Olivia shuddered, but didn't look away. She wasn't the scared little girl he had tried to intimidate anymore. She was stronger now, and she wasn't alone. After the hearing, Olivia, Sarah, and Laura sat together in a quiet room outside the courtroom. Laura hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "If I had spoken up sooner, maybe this wouldn't have happened to you." Sarah reached out and touched her arm. "You did what you could to protect yourself and your children. We all did the best we could. The important thing is that it's over now." Olivia nodded. "You were brave, Laura. You helped us more than you know." Laura smiled faintly. "You were brave too, Olivia. You stood up to him when it mattered most." "You're stronger than I ever was." For the first time in what felt like forever, Olivia felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. There would be more court dates, more challenges ahead. But for now, she allowed herself to breathe, knowing they had taken the first step toward freedom. The drive home was quiet. Sarah reached over and squeezed Olivia's hand as they pulled into the driveway. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she said softly. "You were amazing today." Olivia smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I just wanted to protect us, Mom. That's all." As they walked inside, the weight of the past months began to lift. The house felt different, lighter, safer. Olivia knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she believed they could make it. But as she got ready for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's words in the courtroom weren't just an empty threat. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered, "This isn't over." It had been 2 weeks since Greg was taken into custody. Olivia and her mom tried to settle back into a normal routine, but the lingering shadows of his threats made it difficult. Sarah took extra shifts at the bakery, both to make ends meet and to distract herself. Olivia returned to school, though her focus was shaky, and every loud noise or unfamiliar face sent her heart racing. One crisp Thursday morning, as Sarah was leaving for work, she hesitated at the door. "Olivia," she said, turning back to her daughter, "I need you to stay alert today. Lock the doors, and don't answer the phone unless it's me." "Okay." Olivia nodded, trying to appear braver than she felt. "I will, Mom. Don't worry." Sarah forced a smile, kissed Olivia's forehead, and left. As the door clicked shut, Olivia turned the deadbolt and checked all the windows, something that had become part of her daily routine. Satisfied that everything was secure, she sat down at the kitchen table with her schoolwork. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting back to Greg. The court had ordered him to remain in custody until his trial, but Olivia couldn't shake the memory of his last words to her. "This isn't over." That afternoon, as Olivia worked through a math assignment, the phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, her stomach tightening when she saw it was an unknown number. For a moment, she debated letting it ring, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the receiver cautiously. "Hello?" A pause. Then a low, gravelly voice she recognized immediately. "Olivia." Her blood turned to ice. It was Greg. "How did you get this number?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Greg chuckled, the sound sending shivers down her spine. "You think the police can keep me locked up forever? You're wrong. I always find a way, Olivia. And when I do, you and your mother will pay for what you've done." Olivia slammed the phone down, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stared at it, half expecting it to ring again. But the silence that followed was almost worse. She grabbed her phone and dialed her mom. "Mom!" she cried when Sarah picked up. "He called me. Greg called me." "What?" Sarah's voice was panicked. "How is that even possible?" "He's in jail." "I don't know," Olivia said, pacing the kitchen, but he sounded confident, like he knows he's getting out. Okay, Sarah said, trying to calm her down. "Stay inside. I'll call the police and come home right away." Olivia nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "Hurry, Mom, please." Within an hour, Sarah was home, and 2 officers had arrived to take Olivia's statement. They assured her that Greg was still in custody and that it was likely he had used a contraband phone smuggled into the jail. While they promised to investigate, their reassurances did little to ease Olivia's anxiety. That night, as Sarah locked up the house, she turned to Olivia. "We're not going to let him scare us," she said firmly. "He doesn't have power over us anymore." Olivia nodded, but she didn't feel as confident. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her ears straining to pick up any unusual sounds. Sleep didn't come easily. 2 days later, Sarah woke Olivia early. "Get dressed," she said, her tone urgent. "We're going to Aunt Laura's." Olivia blinked in confusion. "What? Why?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone. On the screen was a news article. The headline made Olivia's stomach drop. "Greg Thatcher escapes police custody." "What?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "They didn't give many details," Sarah said, her hands shaking as she tried to keep her voice steady. But the police called me this morning. They're sending officers to keep an eye on the house, but I don't want to take any chances. We're leaving now. Olivia quickly got dressed, her heart pounding. As they packed a few essentials, Olivia couldn't stop the flood of questions racing through her mind. How had Greg escaped? Was he coming for them? And if he was, how would they ever be safe? The drive to Aunt Laura's house was tense. Sarah kept checking the rearview mirror, her grip on the steering wheel tight. Olivia sat silently, clutching her backpack as if it could protect her. When they arrived, Aunt Laura greeted them with open arms. Come in, she said, ushering them inside. You'll be safe here. Laura's house was small but cozy, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Olivia felt a flicker of relief as she stepped inside, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of Greg's escape. We'll figure this out, Laura said as they settled in. Greg's not going to get away with this. That night, Olivia struggled to sleep again. The unfamiliar surroundings, combined with her fear of Greg, made it impossible to relax. Around midnight, she heard a noise outside her window, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. Her heart leapt into her throat. She crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, she saw nothing. But then, in the faint glow of the streetlight, she saw a figure standing across the street, watching the house. It was Greg. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared out the window, unable to look away from the figure standing across the street. Even in the dim light, she could make out the familiar outline of Greg, his broad shoulders, his stiff posture, and the way he seemed to radiate anger. Her first instinct was to scream, but she stopped herself. If Greg realized she'd seen him, what would he do? Instead, she backed away from the window, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might drown out any other sound. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and dialed her mom's number, her hands trembling. Sarah answered after the first ring. Mom, Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. He's here. He's outside. There was a moment of stunned silence before Sarah replied, her voice trembling. Are you sure? Yes, Olivia said, her eyes darting back to the window. She peeked through the curtain again, and Greg was still there, standing motionless like a predator watching its prey. I'm coming, Sarah said. Don't make any noise. Stay in your room and lock the door. Olivia nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. She hung up and locked the bedroom door, then pressed her back against it. Her mind raced. What was Greg planning? Had he followed them here? And why wasn't he making a move? Minutes felt like hours as Olivia waited, her ears straining to hear any sound. Finally, she heard her mom's footsteps in the hallway. Sarah knocked softly on the door. It's me, honey. Let me in. Olivia unlocked the door, and Sarah stepped inside, her face pale but determined. I called the police, she said, holding her phone tightly. They're on their way. What if he tries to get inside before they get here? Olivia asked, her voice shaking. Sarah placed a hand on Olivia's shoulder. He won't. We'll stay here together, and we won't let him hurt us. Just as she spoke, there was a loud bang on the front door. Both of them jumped, their eyes wide with fear. Greg's voice boomed from outside. Open the door, Sarah. You think you can run from me? You can't hide. Sarah grabbed Olivia's hand and pulled her toward the corner of the room, away from the door. Stay quiet, she whispered. The police will be here soon. The banging grew louder, and Greg's shouts became more frantic. You think you can take my life away? You and that brat ruined everything. Olivia felt tears streaming down her face. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The walls seemed to shake with every hit. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Greg had forced his way inside. Sarah grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table and motioned for Olivia to stay hidden. Don't move, she whispered. I'll handle this. No, Mom. Olivia protested, but Sarah was already out the door. Olivia stayed frozen in the corner, her heart pounding. She could hear Greg's heavy footsteps downstairs, followed by Sarah's voice. Get out of here, Greg. The police are coming. Not without you, Greg snarled. You think I'm scared of the cops? You're coming with me, and so is that little liar. Olivia couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911 again. The operator picked up immediately. "He's inside," Olivia whispered, tears choking her voice. "Please hurry. We're almost there," the operator assured her. "Stay where you are and keep the line open." Olivia clutched the phone tightly, listening to the escalating confrontation downstairs. She could hear Sarah trying to reason with Greg, but his voice grew louder and more aggressive. Then came the sound of something crashing, glass breaking, followed by a sharp cry. Her blood ran cold. "Mom," she whispered into the phone, but there was no answer. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wails cutting through the chaos. Olivia rushed to the window and saw the flashing lights approaching. Relief flooded her as several police cars screeched to a halt outside the house. Officers poured out, guns drawn as they stormed the house. Olivia stayed at the window, her heart pounding as she watched them burst through the front door. Shouts echoed from downstairs, followed by Greg's angry roar. Moments later, she heard the sound of a struggle, then Greg's voice screaming, "Let me go. She's mine." Olivia's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, clutching her phone as tears streamed down her face. It was over. The police had him. A few minutes later, an officer knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Olivia? It's safe now. You can come out." She opened the door to see a kind-looking officer standing there. "Where's my mom?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's downstairs," the officer said. "She's a little shaken up, but she's okay. Let's get you to her." Olivia followed him downstairs, her legs trembling with every step. When she saw Sarah sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped in a blanket, she ran to her and hugged her tightly. "Mom, I was so scared," Olivia sobbed. Sarah held her close, stroking her hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe now." Greg was being led out in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury. He shouted at them as the officers dragged him away. "You'll regret this. Both of you." But Olivia didn't feel scared anymore. For the first time, she felt a sense of strength. She had faced her fears and survived. That night, as they lay awake in Aunt Laura's guest room, Sarah turned to Olivia and whispered, "You saved us, you know?" Olivia looked at her mom, confused. "What do you mean?" "You stood up to him," Sarah said. "You were brave when I wasn't. You made me believe we could get out of this. And we did." Olivia didn't know what to say. She still felt the weight of everything that had happened, but for the first time, she also felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived Greg's wrath, and they were stronger for it. But as she drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in the back of her mind. What if he comes back? The days following Greg's arrest brought a fragile sense of relief, but the fear lingered. Olivia and Sarah stayed at Aunt Laura's house, under constant police protection. They tried to rebuild their routines, but the shadow of Greg's escape and eventual capture still loomed over them. One morning, as Olivia sat on the porch with a steaming mug of hot chocolate, Laura joined her, carrying a small photo album. She placed it on the table between them and gave Olivia a soft smile. "I thought you might want to know more about Greg's past," Laura said gently. "It might help you understand why he's like this. Not to excuse him, but to make sense of it all." Olivia hesitated before opening the album. Inside were pictures of Greg from years ago, smiling with his first family, holding a baby, and even standing proudly in front of a house. It was hard to reconcile the man in the photos with the monster she had come to know. Was he always like this? Olivia asked, her voice quiet. Laura nodded. In some ways, yes. But it didn't start as bad as it became. He had a rough childhood. His dad was abusive, and his mom left when he was young. That kind of pain leaves scars. Unfortunately, instead of breaking the cycle, he carried it forward. Olivia frowned, tracing the edge of one photo with her finger. It doesn't make what he did okay. No, it doesn't, Laura agreed. But understanding his past helps us move forward. We can't let his anger define us. A few days later, the police visited to provide an update. Officer Patel, a woman with a calm demeanor, sat down with Sarah and Olivia in the living room. Greg's been transferred to a high-security facility, she explained. He won't have access to phones or any other way to contact you. Olivia felt a weight lift off her chest. So, He can't hurt us anymore? That's right, Officer Patel said. But I won't sugarcoat it. He's still facing trial, and the legal process can take time. You may need to testify again. Olivia's stomach churned at the thought, but she nodded. I'll do it, she said firmly. I don't want him to hurt anyone else. Sarah squeezed her hand, pride shining in her eyes. We'll get through it together. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Olivia and Sarah began to feel safe again. Olivia returned to school, where her friends rallied around her. She didn't tell them everything, but they knew enough to be supportive. One afternoon, Olivia stayed late to work on a group project in the library. As she packed up her things to leave, she noticed a piece of paper folded neatly on top of her backpack. Frowning, she opened it and froze. You can't hide from me forever. Her hands trembled as she scanned the library, but there was no one suspicious in sight. She stuffed the note into her bag and ran to the principal's office, her heart pounding. That evening, as Olivia recounted the incident to Sarah and Laura, she noticed how pale her mom had become. Do you think it was Greg? Olivia asked. Sarah shook her head. He's in a maximum security facility. There's no way he could have done this, but what if someone else is helping him? Olivia pressed. Laura leaned forward, her expression serious. The important thing is to let the police handle this. We'll report the note first thing in the morning. Despite the reassurances, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every knock on the door made her jump. The fear she thought she had conquered came rushing back, more intense than ever. One night, as she lay in bed, a faint tapping sound reached her ears. She sat up, straining to hear it again. There it was, soft, deliberate, and coming from the window. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she crept toward the window and peeked through the curtain. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, the light from a street lamp flickered, illuminating a figure standing near the edge of the yard. It wasn't Greg this time. It was someone else, a man she didn't recognize, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He stood motionless, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Olivia's first instinct was to scream, but she forced herself to stay quiet. She backed away from the window and grabbed her phone. Dialing 911, she whispered, "There's someone outside. Please, send someone fast." The operator assured her that officers were on their way. Olivia stayed on the line, her heart pounding as she listened to the faint tapping. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Minutes later, red and blue lights flooded the yard. Olivia heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and the sound of officers shouting. She stayed in her room, too scared to look outside. Finally, there was a knock on her bedroom door. "Olivia, it's me," Sarah said. "The police want to talk to you." Olivia opened the door and followed her mom downstairs. The officers had the man in handcuffs, but as they led him to the squad car, he turned his head and glared at Olivia. Even though she didn't recognize him, the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. "Who is he?" Olivia asked, her voice shaking. One of the officers shook his head. "We don't know yet. He's refusing to identify himself. But don't worry. We'll find out what he wanted and why he was here." As the squad car drove away, Olivia felt a cold knot of fear settle in her chest. First Greg, now this stranger. It felt like the nightmare would never end. Later that night, Sarah sat with Olivia in her room. "We'll figure this out," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Olivia's face. "You're not alone in this." Olivia nodded, but her thoughts were racing. Who was that man? Was he connected to Greg? And most importantly, how much danger were they still in? The morning after the mysterious man's arrest, Olivia woke to find Sarah and Aunt Laura huddled at the kitchen table, their voices low and tense. As soon as Olivia entered, they stopped talking and looked at her with forced smiles. "What's going on?" Olivia asked, narrowing her eyes. She hated being left in the dark, especially now. Sarah sighed and gestured for her to sit. "The police called early this morning," she began. "The man they arrested last night. He's refusing to talk." Olivia frowned. "So they don't know why he was here?" Laura shook her head. "Not yet, but they did some digging. His name is Neil Parsons. He's a former cellmate of Greg's." The knot in Olivia's stomach tightened. Greg sent him, didn't he? Sarah hesitated, but Olivia could see the answer in her eyes. They're still investigating, Sarah said carefully, but they found a note in Neil's pocket with our address on it. It's possible Greg asked him to come here. Olivia felt a wave of anger and fear crash over her. Why can't he just leave us alone? She cried, her voice trembling. He's in prison. How is he still doing this? Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. We'll figure it out, Olivia. The police promised to keep us safe. Olivia nodded, but her mind was spinning. Greg's reach seemed endless, and it was becoming clear that he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The next few days were tense. Officers were stationed outside Aunt Laura's house, and Olivia wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone. She tried to focus on school and her friends, but the constant reminders of Greg's threats made it impossible to relax. One evening, as she worked on homework at the kitchen table, the landline phone rang. Laura picked it up, her face tightening as she listened. Who is it? Sarah asked, her voice low. Laura didn't answer right away. She handed the phone to Sarah, her expression grim. It's the police. Sarah took the phone and listened, her face growing pale. What? She whispered, her free hand clutching the edge of the table. How did this happen? Olivia sat up straighter, her heart pounding. Mom? What's going on? Sarah put the phone down slowly, her hands shaking. Greg escaped again. The room fell into stunned silence. Olivia stared at her mom, unable to believe what she just heard. How? She finally managed to say. How did he escape again? Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. The police didn't give me all the details, but it sounds like he had help. They think Neil Parsons was just the beginning. Laura stood, her hands on her hips. So what are they doing to protect us? They're increasing patrols in the area and assigning more officers to watch the house, Sarah said. But they don't know where Greg is yet. Olivia felt her chest tighten. She had thought they were finally safe, but now the nightmare was starting all over again. That night, sleep was impossible. Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and groan of the house. Every sound made her jump, and her mind kept conjuring images of Greg lurking outside, waiting to strike. At around 2 a.m., she heard a faint noise, like footsteps on the porch. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, straining to listen. There it was again, a slow, deliberate creak of wood. She grabbed her phone and tiptoed to the window, her hands shaking. Peeking through the curtain, she saw a shadowy figure moving toward the back of the house. Her breath caught in her throat. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers and whispered into the phone. He's here. Greg's here. The operator's voice was calm but urgent. Stay where you are. Officers are on their way. Olivia stayed on the line, her back pressed against the wall. She could hear her mom and Aunt Laura stirring in their rooms, no doubt woken by the sound of footsteps outside. A loud bang came from the back door, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Olivia's stomach dropped. Greg was trying to break in. The next few minutes felt like hours. Olivia heard Sarah and Laura moving around downstairs, their voices hushed but panicked. She wanted to run to them, but she was too afraid to leave her room. Then came the sound of sirens. The familiar red and blue lights lit up the yard, and Olivia felt a small flicker of hope. She peeked out the window again and saw officers surrounding the house, their guns drawn. Greg Thatcher. One of them shouted, "Come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the back of the house, Greg's voice rang out. "You'll never take me alive." Olivia's heart pounded as she heard a commotion, shouts, footsteps, and what sounded like a struggle. She pressed herself against the wall, praying that the officers would stop him before he could hurt anyone. Finally, she heard the sound of handcuffs clicking. An officer's voice came over the radio. "We've got him." Olivia let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. It was over again. The police stayed late into the night, questioning everyone and inspecting the damage Greg had caused. As they prepared to leave, one of the officers pulled Sarah aside. "We found this in his pocket," he said, handing her a folded piece of paper. Sarah opened it and gasped. It was a picture of Olivia, taken from a distance. Underneath, in Greg's scrawled handwriting, were the words, She's mine. Sarah's hands trembled as she showed the picture to Olivia. We need to stay strong, she said, her voice shaking. We can't let him scare us. But Olivia could see the fear in her mom's eyes. And deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The atmosphere in Aunt Laura's house was suffocating after Greg's second capture. The picture of Olivia with his chilling message, "She's mine," was burned into their minds, casting a shadow over every moment. Sarah spent hours on the phone with the police, demanding answers and pleading for tighter protection, while Olivia tried to find some sense of normalcy in her schoolwork. But nothing felt normal anymore. 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't the police. It was Daniel Harper, the social worker who had testified against Greg during the first hearing. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of urgency. "I wanted to check in with you," he said. "I heard about what happened and thought you should know something." "What is it?" Sarah asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Greg's behavior in custody is escalating," Daniel explained. "He's not just angry, he's obsessive. He keeps talking about Olivia and how she ruined his life. The authorities are doing everything they can to ensure he stays locked up. But what?" Sarah pressed, her voice tinged with panic. Daniel hesitated. "It's clear he's fixated on her. You need to be vigilant." Sarah thanked him and hung up, her face pale as she turned to Olivia and Laura. "We need to do more to protect ourselves," she said firmly. Laura nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. It's time we went somewhere he can't find us." The next morning, they packed their belongings and left Aunt Laura's house under police escort. The officers assured them that Greg was under constant surveillance at the detention center, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that he would find a way to reach them. He always did. Their destination was a safe house arranged by the police, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from town. It was equipped with reinforced locks, security cameras, and a direct line to law enforcement. Despite its isolation, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe here, they could finally be safe. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and large windows that overlooked the dense forest. Sarah busied herself setting up their new home while Olivia explored the surrounding area. For the first time in weeks, she felt a hint of peace as she walked through the quiet woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees. But that peace was short-lived. On their second night at the cabin, Olivia woke to a strange sound, a faint beeping, like a distant alarm. She sat up, her heart racing, and listened closely. The sound was coming from outside. She crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The yard was illuminated by the faint glow of the security lights, but everything seemed normal. She was about to turn away when something caught her eye, a red dot of light moving across the side of the cabin. Her blood ran cold. It was a laser pointer. Olivia backed away from the window, her mind racing. Was someone out there? She ran to Sarah's room and shook her awake. "Mom, there's someone outside," she whispered urgently. Sarah bolted upright, her eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "I saw a laser," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "Someone's watching us." Sarah grabbed her phone and called the police while Laura checked the security cameras. The video feed showed nothing but trees and shadows, but the beeping sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the air grew thick with tension. Sarah lit a flashlight and pulled Olivia close. "Stay with me," she said firmly. "We'll get through this." Laura barricaded the front door with a heavy dresser while Sarah checked the windows. The beeping sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. Suddenly, there was a loud crash at the back of the cabin. Olivia screamed, and Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Footsteps pounded on the wooden floor, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "He's here," Laura whispered, her face pale. The next moments were a blur. The front door burst open, and Greg stepped inside, his face twisted with fury. He looked wild, disheveled and dangerous, his eyes darting around the room until they landed on Olivia. "You think you can hide from me?" he snarled, his voice echoing through the cabin. "You think I'll let you destroy my life?" Sarah stepped in front of Olivia, her arms outstretched. "You're not touching her," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Greg laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "And what are you going to do to stop me?" "You're nothing, Sarah. Just like your daughter." Olivia's fear turned to anger. She stepped out from behind her mom, her hands clenched into fists. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You don't control us anymore." Greg's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Is that so?" he sneered. "Let's see how brave you really are." Before he could take another step, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed outside the windows, and Greg's expression twisted into one of panic. "No," he muttered, backing toward the door. "Not again." The front door burst open, and officers swarmed into the cabin, their guns drawn. Greg tried to run, but they tackled him to the ground, pinning him as he thrashed and screamed. "It's over, Greg," one of the officers said, cuffing his hands behind his back. "You're not going to hurt anyone else." As the police led Greg away, Olivia collapsed into her mom's arms, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he was going to kill us," she whispered. Sarah held her tightly. "He's gone now. He can't hurt us anymore." For the first time, Olivia allowed herself to believe it might be true. That night, as they sat together in the now secure cabin, Sarah turned to Olivia. "You were brave tonight," she said softly. "You faced him, and you didn't let him win." Olivia nodded, her heart still heavy with everything they had been through. "I just want this to be over," she said quietly. Sarah wrapped an arm around her. "It will be, sweetheart. We're going to make sure of it." But deep down, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's obsession would never truly end. The following days brought a cautious sense of relief. Greg was back in custody, and the police assured Olivia and Sarah that this time, the security measures were airtight. His latest escape had rattled even the most seasoned officers, and they were determined not to let it happen again. For Olivia, the trauma of that night lingered like a dark cloud. She tried to focus on her schoolwork and spend hours journaling, hoping it would help her process everything. But sleep was still elusive, and every creak or shadow sent her heart racing. One afternoon, while Sarah and Laura were out shopping for groceries, Olivia decided to go for a walk in the woods surrounding the cabin. The fresh air and sunlight felt like a small reprieve from the constant tension. She followed a well-worn path, her thoughts wandering as she listened to the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of peace, until she noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the trail, a small pile of rocks caught her attention. They were stacked deliberately, forming a crude pyramid. Olivia frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She knelt to examine it and noticed a piece of paper tucked beneath the top rock. Her hands shook as she unfolded the note. The handwriting was familiar, Greg's sharp, uneven scrawl. The message was chillingly simple. "I will always find you." Olivia stumbled back, her breath hitching. How was this possible? Greg was in custody, wasn't he? She stuffed the note into her pocket and ran back to the cabin, her pulse pounding in her ears. When Sarah and Laura returned, Olivia showed them the note. Sarah's face went pale, and Laura immediately called the police. Officers arrived within the hour, combing the woods for any sign of who might have left the note. One of the officers, Detective Harris, sat down with Olivia and Sarah at the kitchen table. He was a tall man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, but even he seemed unsettled. "We've verified that Greg is still in custody," he said. "There's no way he could have left this note himself." "Then who did?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "Is someone else helping him?" Harris hesitated before answering. "It's possible. Greg has connections, and he's proven that he's willing to use them. But we're doing everything we can to identify anyone who might be working with him." Sarah put a protective arm around Olivia. "What do we do now?" Harris leaned forward, his expression serious. "We're going to increase patrols in the area and review the security footage from the cabin. In the meantime, I recommend staying indoors as much as possible. If you see anything suspicious, call us immediately." That night, Olivia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The note had shattered the fragile sense of safety she'd been clinging to. She couldn't stop wondering who might be out there, watching and waiting. A sudden noise jolted her from her thoughts. a faint tapping at the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned her head slowly. The tapping came again, louder this time. Summoning all her courage, Olivia crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she noticed a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Her heart raced as she recognized the man from the woods, the same man who had been arrested outside Aunt Laura's house. Neil Parsons. Olivia backed away from the window, her hands shaking. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically, "He's here. Neil Parsons is outside the cabin." The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but Olivia's fear only grew. What if Neil got inside before they arrived? Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed outside, and Olivia heard the sound of sirens. She ran to the front door and saw officers pouring into the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Neil didn't run. He stood calmly near the edge of the woods, his hands raised as the officers surrounded him. Olivia watched from the window, her chest tight with fear and confusion. Why had he come back? What did he want? As the officers led Neil away in handcuffs, Detective Harris approached the cabin. Sarah opened the door, her face pale but resolute. "Did he say anything?" Sarah asked. Harris nodded grimly. "He said he was here to deliver a message." "What message?" Olivia asked, stepping forward. Harris hesitated, then sighed. "He wouldn't tell us. But we found something in his pocket." He handed Sarah another note, this one written in the same jagged handwriting as the first. Sarah unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. The message read, "This isn't over. Greg always wins." The days that followed were a blur of police interviews and heightened security measures. Neil refused to cooperate, and the authorities struggled to piece together his connection to Greg. Olivia felt like she was living in a constant state of fear, always waiting for the next threat to appear. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension began to ease. Neil was held without bail, and Greg's trial date was set. Olivia and Sarah worked closely with their lawyers to prepare their testimony, determined to see Greg face justice once and for all. Despite everything, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that Greg still had one last move to make. The thought haunted her as the trial date approached, a constant reminder that their fight wasn't over yet. One evening, as Olivia sat on the porch with her journal, she noticed a car pull into the driveway. It wasn't a police car or anyone she recognized. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a briefcase. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, joining her on the porch. "I don't know," Olivia said, her stomach tightening. The man approached, his expression neutral but professional. "Mrs. Thatcher? Miss Olivia? My name is James Porter. I'm Greg Thatcher's attorney." Sarah stiffened. "What do you want?" Porter opened his briefcase and handed Sarah an envelope. "My client has a message for you. I suggest you read it carefully." Olivia's hands clenched into fists as Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Greg's handwriting. The message was clear and chilling. "I'm not finished yet. See you in court." The days leading up to the trial were filled with a tense mixture of preparation and dread. Olivia and Sarah met with their lawyers regularly, reviewing their testimony and going over every detail of Greg's behavior. The prosecution had built a strong case, relying on the evidence Olivia had gathered, Laura's testimony, and the terrifying incidents that had occurred since Greg's arrest. Despite this, Olivia couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. Greg's threats felt heavier than ever, especially after the letter delivered by his attorney. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The morning of the trial, Olivia stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her dress. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the necklace Sarah had given her, a simple pendant engraved with the word brave. "You're ready for this," Sarah said, appearing behind her. She placed a comforting hand on Olivia's shoulder. "No matter what happens, we'll stand together." Olivia nodded, swallowing hard. "I just want it to be over." The courthouse was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Olivia kept her head down, clutching Sarah's hand as they pushed through the crowd. Inside, the courtroom was cold and formal, the weight of justice palpable in the air. Olivia's heart raced as she took her seat beside Sarah. Across the room, Greg sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his eyes cold and calculating. He locked eyes with Olivia and smirked, a small, smug gesture that sent a chill down her spine. "Don't look at him," Sarah whispered, squeezing her hand. "He wants to intimidate you." "Don't let him." Olivia nodded, forcing herself to focus on the judge as the trial began. The prosecution laid out their case with precision, presenting photos, medical records, and testimony from experts who had analyzed Greg's pattern of behavior. Laura took the stand first, recounting her harrowing experiences with Greg and the lengths she had gone to in order to protect her children. Next came Daniel Harper, the social worker who had worked on Greg's case for years. He detailed Greg's history of abuse and manipulation, painting a clear picture of the danger he posed. Finally, it was Olivia's turn. She walked to the witness stand, her legs feeling like jelly. The courtroom seemed to close in around her as she took her seat and swore to tell the truth. As the prosecutor began asking questions, Olivia focused on her breathing, reminding herself why she was there. "I knew something was wrong when I saw the bruises on my mom," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "At first, I didn't want to believe it. But Greg's anger, it was always there. He made us feel like it was our fault." She recounted the nights of terror, the threats, and the final confrontation that had landed Greg in custody. The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. When the prosecutor finished, Greg's defense attorney rose. He approached the stand with a practiced smile, his tone smooth and calculated. "Olivia," he began, "you've been through a lot. But isn't it true that you and Greg had disagreements even before these alleged incidents?" Olivia frowned. "He was always strict. But that doesn't mean—" "Strict?" The attorney interrupted. "So, you didn't like him telling you what to do?" "No," Olivia said firmly. "I didn't like him hurting my mom and me." The attorney pressed on, trying to paint Greg as a misunderstood father figure, but Olivia refused to waver. She answered each question with clarity, refusing to let him twist her words. When her testimony ended, Olivia returned to her seat beside Sarah. Her mom hugged her tightly. "You were amazing," Sarah whispered. "I'm so proud of you." As the trial continued, Greg's defense team attempted to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Greg's past should not define his present. But the overwhelming weight of testimony and documentation made it clear that their arguments were weak. Still, Greg's smug demeanor never faltered. Olivia couldn't understand how he could sit there so calmly, as if he still believed he could win. On the final day of the trial, the judge prepared to deliver her ruling. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air. Olivia held her breath as the judge began to speak. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, it is clear that the defendant, Greg Thatcher, has engaged in a sustained pattern of abuse, intimidation, and violence. His actions have caused immeasurable harm to his victims. The judge paused, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Greg. "Mr. Thatcher, your lack of remorse and your attempts to intimidate your victims further demonstrate the danger you pose to society. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Greg's face twisted in rage as he shot to his feet. "This isn't justice," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You'll all regret this." The bailiffs quickly restrained him, but not before he locked eyes with Olivia one last time. "You haven't seen the last of me," he growled as they dragged him away. After the verdict, Olivia and Sarah stood outside the courthouse, taking deep breaths of the cool afternoon air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Olivia felt a weight lift from her chest. "It's over," she said softly. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Olivia. We did it." But as they walked to the car, Olivia couldn't shake the memory of Greg's final words. She knew he was behind bars, but his threats lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. For now, though, they were free, and that was enough. The weeks following Greg's sentencing were a mix of relief and cautious rebuilding. Olivia and Sarah returned to their lives, but the scars left by Greg's abuse were not easy to heal. The cabin, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a constant reminder of the fear they had endured. They decided to leave and start fresh in a new town, away from the memories and shadows of the past. Packing up was bittersweet. Aunt Laura stayed behind, promising to visit often, but she encouraged them to move forward. "You deserve to be happy," she said. "Don't let him keep you trapped, even in your mind." Their new home was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Sarah took a job at a local bakery, and Olivia enrolled in a new school. She was nervous about starting over, but her classmates were welcoming, and for the first time in years, she began to feel like a normal teenager. One evening, as Olivia sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah joined her with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. They sipped in silence for a moment before Sarah spoke. "You know, you're the bravest person I've ever met," she said, her voice soft. "You stood up to him when I couldn't. You saved us." Olivia smiled faintly, staring at the horizon. "I was scared the whole time," she admitted, "but I couldn't let him keep hurting us." Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's what bravery is, doing the right thing, even when you're scared." Olivia nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. She thought back to everything they had been through, the fear, the fights, the courtroom battles, and realized just how far they had come. Months passed, and life gradually returned to normal. Olivia found new friends, joined the school's art club, and even started speaking at local events about her experience. She shared her story not to dwell on the pain, but to inspire others to stand up for themselves and seek help when they needed it. One afternoon, she spoke at a community center, addressing a small crowd of parents, teens, and social workers. "For a long time, I thought no one would believe me," she said. "But I learned that the truth matters, and so do we. No one deserves to live in fear." The audience applauded, and afterward, a young girl approached Olivia with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Hearing you talk, it makes me feel like I can be brave too." Olivia smiled, her heart full. "You can," she said, "and you're not alone." As the years went by, Olivia and Sarah built a life filled with love and laughter. They celebrated birthdays, holidays, and small victories, cherishing every moment of peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Greg's threats no longer held power over them. He remained in prison, unable to harm anyone else. But Olivia knew that her journey wasn't just about escaping him. It was about finding herself, reclaiming her voice, and helping others do the same. One evening, as Olivia prepared for her high school graduation, she found the necklace her mom had given her, the one engraved with Brave. She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of everything it represented. "I did it," she whispered to herself, smiling. When she stepped onto the stage to receive her diploma, the audience erupted in applause. Sarah was in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she clapped. Olivia felt a swell of pride, not just for what she had accomplished academically, but for the journey she had taken to get there. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, growth, and the power of love and truth to overcome even the darkest of times. As she stood on the stage, basking in the cheers and support of those around her, Olivia looked to the future with hope. She had faced the worst and come out stronger. And now, she was ready to embrace the life she had fought so hard to reclaim.